The first time I saw her, every man in that ballroom found something else to look at. Not the floor, not their drinks, anywhere but her face. The Ridgemont Hotel in Charleston was lit up like something out of a dream that night, all those crystal fixtures throwing light across the dance floor, and the Bellwether Foundation's Spring Gala was the kind of event where you could feel the money in the air before you ever saw a price tag. Senators, surgeons, men who owned half the shipping routes on the East Coast. They were all there, and I was working the room in a rented tux that didn't quite fit, because 6 months earlier my mother's hospital bills had eaten through what was left of my savings, and this catering gig was the only thing keeping the lights on at home. My name's Theodore Lansing, Theo to anyone who's bothered to ask twice, and that night I was supposed to be invisible. Refill the champagne, check the place cards, disappear into the wallpaper. Then she walked in, and the whole room did this strange, collective flinch. Her name was Genevieve Hartley. I didn't know that yet. All I knew was the dress. Deep emerald, the kind of green that makes a room go quiet for the right reasons, and the left side of her jaw, where the skin pulled tight and shiny down toward her collarbone, old scar tissue that caught the light differently than the rest of her did. She walked like she was daring someone to say something. Nobody did. They just looked away, which in some ways is worse. If you've ever watched someone get erased by a room full of people too polite to stare and too cowardly to be kind, you know exactly the feeling I'm describing. If that's ever happened to you, or if you've ever been the one looking away and hated yourself for it after, go ahead and like this video right now, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe because I've got a lot more of these stories and I think you'll want to hear them. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the dance floor. My job was logistics, make sure the band had water, make sure the kitchen wasn't backed up, make sure nobody important ran out of wine. But when the orchestra struck up the first waltz and couples started pairing off in that practiced, effortless way rich people have of finding each other, I watched Genevieve Hartley stand alone at the edge of the floor, hands folded in front of her like she was bracing for something, and not one man crossed that room to ask her to dance. Not one. I watched a congressman's son suddenly get very interested in his cufflinks. I watched a guy I recognized from the local news, some hedge fund type, turn his whole body away like he'd spotted someone more interesting across the room, when there was no one there at all. These were men who'd talk your ear off about risk and courage in a boardroom, and not a single one of them could walk 20 feet. I didn't know her story. I didn't know about the fire or the warehouse, or any of it. That came later. All I knew was the look on her face. And it wasn't anger. It was tired. The specific tired of someone who's done the math on how many times this is going to happen tonight and has already accepted the number. My manager, a sharp-tongued man named Gerald Pruitt, grabbed my elbow from behind the bar and told me to keep my eyes on the canapé trays and nowhere else. I nodded, and then I put down the tray anyway. I crossed that floor with my heart going like a drum, fully aware that the woman standing in front of me was the only daughter of Richard Hartley, who owned half the commercial real estate in 3 counties, and could have ended my catering company's contract with a single phone call to my boss. Could have ended a lot more than that, honestly, if he'd wanted to. But standing there in front of her, none of that mattered the way it should have. She wasn't Richard Hartley's daughter in that moment. She was just a woman standing by herself at a party, watching everyone else dance. I bowed badly, I'm sure. I'd never bowed to anyone in my life, and asked if she'd like to dance. The room actually went quiet. I felt it more than heard it. That particular hush that happens when 40 conversations stop at once. Genevieve blinked at me like I'd spoken in a language she didn't recognize at first, and for one long second I thought she was pure habit, just out because saying no had probably become the safer choice a long time ago. Instead, she put her hand in mine. Her fingers were cold. Steadier than I expected, though, like she'd trained herself not to shake in public even when everything in her wanted to. We stepped onto that floor and I swear I could feel every eye in the room on us, a physical weight, like walking into wind. I am not a good dancer. I want to be honest about that. I'd learned 3 steps from a YouTube video the night before because some part of me had hoped this exact moment might happen, which sounds insane even as I say it now, but there it is. I was stiff and a half beat behind the music the whole time. But I kept my eyes on her face, not on the scar, just on her. And somewhere around the second turn I watched her shoulders come down from around her ears, just as slightly, like she'd been holding them up there for a long, long time, and had finally found one place in the room where she didn't have to. Up close, the scarring told its own kind of story. The pull of old grafts near her ear, a faint line along her jaw that caught the light when she turned her head. None of it frightened me. If anything, I found myself wondering what it had cost her to survive whatever put it there, and admiring her for it without even knowing the details yet. The music slowed, and so did she. By the middle of the song, her hand had stopped being cold in mine. She looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as disbelieving, like she'd half convinced herself this wasn't really happening, and was waiting for the part where it stopped. Halfway through the dance, I caught sight of a man on the mezzanine level watching us. Tall, gray at the temples, a drink in his hand that he wasn't drinking. I didn't know it was Richard Hartley yet, but I knew, the way you know weather is coming, that this mattered more than I understood. His face wasn't angry. It was something more complicated than that. Watchful, like he was recalculating something he'd given up on a while back. I found out later that 2 years before that night, Genevieve had been working a volunteer shift at a community shelter in North Charleston when an electrical fire broke out in the kitchen. She'd gone back in for a teenage volunteer who'd frozen at the top of the stairs, gotten the girl out through a side door, and taken the worst of the flames doing it. The girl walked away without a scratch. Genevieve spent 4 months in burn recovery and came out the other side with scarring she'd never fully hide again, and a kind of public sympathy that lasted about 3 news cycles before it curdled, the way these things do, into people just staring instead. The waltz-ins ended and she didn't pull her hand back right away. Her fingers tightened around mine, just slightly, like she was trying to hold on to the shape of the moment a second longer than the song allowed. Then she said something I don't think I'll ever stop carrying with me. She told me she wasn't going to forget this, not because I was a good dancer. She actually laughed a little when she said that part, the first real laugh I'd heard from her all night, but because I was the only person in that entire room who'd looked at her, like there was nothing to look away from. The applause that followed was careful, a little uncertain, but it was applause, and I watched 2 or 3 people drift her afterward, starting conversations they clearly hadn't planned on having that night. Something in the room had shifted just a degree or two. I figured that was the end of it. A nice memory to tell my mother about, nothing more. I was wrong about that. The next morning I got a call asking me to come to the Hartley Group offices downtown, 20th floor, and I spent the entire elevator ride convinced I was about to get fired from a job I didn't even technically work for. Richard Hartley calling my catering company directly to make sure I never worked another event in this city again. Instead, when I walked into that office with its wall of windows looking out over the harbor, he studied me for a long moment without saying anything at all, then asked why I'd done it. I told him the truth, because at that point I figured I'd had nothing left to lose. I said nobody deserves to stand alone like that in a room full of people, pretending not to see them. He didn't answer right away. Then he told me something that knocked the wind out of me a little. Genevieve hadn't been to a public event in almost 14 months before that gala. She'd turned down every interview, walked out of 2 different therapy intakes, stopped coming to family dinners that had more than 4 people at them. But that morning she'd asked her father who the kid in the ill-fitting tux was. That conversation rearranged the next year of my life in ways I never saw coming. Richard offered me a position with the Hartley Foundation's Community Outreach Division. Not, he made very clear, because my resume had impressed him, but because his daughter had smiled for real for the first time in over a year, and he wanted to understand why. I started coordinating hospital visits for burn survivors and helping set up a scholarship fund for the children of first responders. Genevieve began showing up to these events too, quietly at first, standing near the back, then closer to the front, slowly walking back into rooms she'd spent over a year avoiding entirely. The first time she spoke in public again was at a children's burn unit outside Atlanta. I remember her hands shaking as she pulled the scarf off her shoulder in front of a room full of kids who all had scars of their own, some far worse than hers. Her voice cracked on the first sentence. She told them surviving wasn't something to apologize for. I stood off to the side of that room with my chest aching in the best possible way. It wasn't a straight line forward, though. Old photos resurfaced online with cruel captions attached. A board member at one of the foundation's partner companies quietly raised concerns about whether her visibility might affect brand perception, an actual phrase someone used in an actual meeting, which still makes me angry to think about. I watched her read through a string of comments late one night after a fundraising dinner, completely silent, and I saw that old exhaustion flicker back into her eyes like it had never fully left. I reminded her of the ballroom, of the choice she'd made to step forward instead of back. It didn't fix everything in one conversation, but it helped. Months turned into a year. The foundation's donor base nearly doubled. The burn survivor support program expanded into 2 more states, and somewhere along the way, between hospital hallways and late nights going over grant paperwork at her kitchen table, what had started as something I couldn't quite name turned into something neither of us had been looking for, but both of us needed badly. One evening, almost exactly a year later, we were back at the Ridgemont for the spring gala again. This time, Genevieve told the event planner she didn't want any kind of announcement, no spotlight, no staged moment built around her story. Just the night, as it actually was. When the band started up, she turned to me first. There were no whispers this time. We walked onto that floor as 2 people who'd simply decided to dance, nothing more dramatic than that, though it felt like the most significant thing I'd ever done. As we moved through the song, she leaned in close and told me that for a long time after the fire, she'd believed beauty and love and belonging were things that had been taken from her permanently, settled accounts she'd never get to argue. She said that night I crossed the ballroom hadn't been about romance at all. Not really, not at first. It had been about dignity, about being looked at like a person instead of an incident. She said I'd given that back to her. If any part of this story found something in you, do me a favor and like this video, send it to someone who's ever felt like they didn't qualify for being seen, and subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And before I go, if you believe every scar carries its own kind of strength, type the word "seen" in the comments. I read every single one. Here's what that year in Charleston taught me. More than anything else, courage doesn't always look like running into a burning building. Sometimes it's just crossing a quiet room while everyone else finds somewhere safer to look. Genevieve told me once that she'd never forget the night I crossed that floor toward her. The truth is, I never forgot it either. Not because of the scars. Because of what she taught a whole room full of strangers, and one underdressed caterer in particular, about what it costs to let yourself be seen and what it's worth.